Okay, Mayor, we are ready.
Okay, we will call the Monday, August the 10th, 2020 special call city council meeting to order. Everybody would join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, and then we will have the invocation. I pledge allegiance
Pledge allegiance
to the flag
of the United
of the
States of
United
America
States
of America and to the republic
Republic,
which it stands,
and
one nation, under God, indivisible,
indivisible,
liberty and justice for all.
justice
For all.
Let us pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the many blessings you bestow upon our community and our citizens. We ask you to continue to look after our citizens, help us get through this pandemic and the problems we've had. Guide us in our deliberations that what we do is pleasing in your eyes and best for our community. Continue to guide us, look after our first responders, our troops, and our citizens. In your name we pray. Amen.
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 Ms. Sykes, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Green,
Here.
Mr. Hill,
Here.
Mr. Jefferson,
Here.
Ms. Moses, Ms. Moses,
She's here.
want to make sure we can hear her. Ms. Moses?
Here, did you hear that?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Mayor Witt,
Here.
Mr. Coberline,
Here.
Mr. Helpenberger,
Here.
and Chief Gilmore. Here.
Okay, we need a motion to approve the agenda as published.
So moved, Mayor.
Second.
Second.
And Ms. Sykes, will you call the roll, please?
Ms. Moses,
Yes.
Mr. Jefferson,
Yes.
Mr. Hill,
Yes.
Mr. Green,
Yes.
Mayor Witt.
Yes. Okay, this is the meeting that we, and here comes Ms. Molly. Here's the meeting that we've been waiting on for a while to discuss the memorial and Old Lusty Park and for our citizens' input. And this is the time that we find out where we're at and have comments from our council members. At this time, I'd like Mr. Helpenberger, if he would, to kind of give us an update.
Okay, sure. We are looking to remove all the hurdles so that when the ownership is determined with the city council, we'll be able to move forward. One of the hurdles is the park ownership. The city attorney was directed to research the ownership of the Lusty Park and the ownership of the Lusty Monument. I don't think he's done with the research. He mentioned it may be less costly if we just ask Columbia County to issue the city a quitclaim deed to convey any interest the county may have in the land to the city of Lake City. If the council wants to pursue this route, just let me know and I'll make a formal request. Monument ownership. I am awaiting the results of the legal research to determine who owns the Lusty Monument. Obviously, this is the main item that needs to be known. Another concern is it's a federal benchmark. There is a federal benchmark in the concrete apron around the Lusty Monument. The benchmark is governed by the National Geodetic Survey, and Dennis Reardon is the representative for Lake City. Basically, he gave us a number of options that he outlined in writing as to the what we could do with this survey. Now, the current mark over there that's in, for all practical purposes, in the base of the monument is of the highest accuracy they have, the first order of accuracy, and it was placed there in 1934. These benchmarks are used by engineers, land surveyors, and planners to provide vertical reference for flood insurance, floodplain management, and construction of buildings. One thing he did mention about this particular marker, it's called Lake City marker, is that's the only one in the downtown area. The next closest one is about 1.5 miles away. And depending on what the city council votes to do, there are several options that could be done with the benchmark. First, if it's decided not to move, there's nothing more to do on the benchmark. But if the council decides to move the monument, you have the option of either resetting the mark or not at all. The Geodetic Survey established these marks, but is not in the business of maintaining those marks now due to budget constraints. So we presented a few options to consider. If we're looking at, we could reestablish the mark at the highest vertical accuracy, which is the first order, which it currently is. And that would involve, it would take 3 to 4 days using geodactyl grade survey equipment. And basically they'd have to line it up against the other federal benchmarks that are miles away. The next option would be to reset the benchmark on a third order reset. And that could be done using normal survey equipment. It doesn't require the leveling of the additional benchmarks. And this would take 1 to 2 days of survey work. And the other option would be not to put the mark back, but this route would leave downtown area with no benchmarks at all to work from. He said when you reset these monuments, you have about a 2-week cure period for the concrete monument or benchmark to be reset. What he is recommending is that if you go ahead and decide to move the monument, then he would recommend you let that marker go with the monument and put a new one in its place, because it would probably be easier to go that route. Then we have the cost issue. I obtained a cost estimate from Chris Leidick, which was an average of the cost to move the Olustee Monument from its present location in Olustee Park to either Oak Lawn Cemetery or the Olustee Battlefield. The average estimate was $145,956. One of the problems here is that there's no room in either of the city-owned cemeteries for the monuments. The only empty spaces in these cemeteries are travel paths to get to the graves, and the other vacant areas of the cemetery have extensive utilities running underground. There are 2 other pieces of city-owned property right across the street from the Oak Lawn Cemetery, but transferring the memorial from one city-owned property to another is not going to be a permanent solution. I also checked into the possibility of relocating the monument to the local Confederate Museum, but there's not enough space on that site either. The Olustee Battlefield location includes 3 acres of state-owned property, and the rest is federally owned. It might be easier to relocate the monument on state-owned property. I've contacted Mr. Manny Perez, the local park manager who oversees the Olustee Battlefield state-owned property, and he's to get back to me on what kind of guidance. He can't make the decision, but he can tell me how difficult the state process might be. Today, we also received a petition of about 662 signatures on it to keep the Olustee Memorial where it is. If you would go that route, then another alternative could be that you possibly would build a new monument to honor the Union soldiers that died in the Battle of Olustee. I obtained a cost estimate also from Chris Leidick that to erect a new monument would cost $121,259. In any case, unless we use the general fund balance, money would have to be raised to either relocate the Olustee Memorial or to create a new memorial honoring the rest of the soldiers that died in the Battle of Olustee. One other impediment is the city ordinance. We currently have an ordinance that protects the public monuments. The city may consider rescinding or amending this ordinance if the monument is determined, if the monument is owned by the city. Basically, this would be another necessary action if you were considering moving the monument. I would also ask City Attorney Fred Koberlein to discuss the status of the park ownership and the monument ownership. And if there's anything else that needed further explanation on what I've already mentioned. We're working diligently on trying to get these impediments cleared up so that whatever decision the city council makes, we won't have to be held back by all these other obstacles. I'm seeking direction from the city council to continue with the investigation. And if the city decides to, if they would relocate the monument to a specific location, then I can get legally binding bids for that cost. But basically that's what I have so far, and we'll continue to work on all these impediments.
Okay, Mr. Koberlein, did you have any comments you wanted to make, or did Mr. Helfenberger pretty well cover it? Is Mr. Koberlein there? Y'all hear me? Hello?
I can't hear him.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, man, but I can't hear Fred.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, I can't hear Mr. Koberlein.
I can't either.
I can't either.
Well, we'll come back to him. At this time, before we take comments from the public, I'd like if the council wants to make any comments at this time, and then we will have comments of council at the end of the.
Mr. Copeland has unmuted now.
Is there anything that anybody wants to say before we start taking public comments?
Yes, I have something I want to say, Mayor.
Sure.
You know, several years ago, I don't know its exact time, but you know, we had the rebel flag on the city seal, and pretty much, well, almost all this council here voted to remove that flag from the
Mayor,
city
can
seal.
you hear me?
Yes.
And it's the same thing with this monument. It's on city property, yet to be seen, but as of now, it's on city property. And I think that the monument needs to be removed from city property with the benchmark be replaced. And that's just my thought on it.
Okay. Are you saying any city property?
Now, well, again, if you're moving from one city property to another city property, you're not really solving the problem.
That's what I was asking.
I would like to see, you know, rightfully, if it can't go in the cemetery, which what Joe just said, there's no room. Why not try to get it moved down to the Olustee Park where they do the Battle of Olustee?
All right. Anybody else have any comments before we move along?
Well, Mayor, I'm inclined to agree with your comments from Mr. Hill. I think what we really is up against is establishing ownership of the memorial. And then once we determine the ownership, well, we also need to establish what are we going to do with it? Where are we going to locate it at? Even if we determine the ownership of it, where are we going to locate it? And so I think we need to, if we can place it on, or if the state would allow us to place it on state property, that may be a viable solution. But I understand that the cemetery doesn't have space for it, and the other agency doesn't have space for it. So it may be worth researching with the state to see if they would allow, where they accept it and go from there. But even if we determine the ownership of it, we still, if that's going to be the consensus of the council, if we're going to, if that's the consent is to move it, we need to have in place some place to move it.
Okay, Mr.
Those are my
Kerbeline?
thoughts.
Thank you. Mr. Kerbeline, did you want to make a comment?
He's muted again, but he doesn't look like he's talking either.
Okay,
Fred?
Mr. Coberline?
all right. Anybody else on the council have any comments at this time?
I'd like to make a comment. Can you
Sure.
hear me?
Mayor.
Yes,
Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
You know, I've thought about this nonstop for several days, thinking about the moving of the obelisk or statue or whatever you want to call it. And it came to me the thought of the possibility of us being the community that does something positive, you know, instead of a total negative. Anybody that knows me knows how I feel about all this. And the thought of the possibility of maybe erecting a statue that respects everyone. Now, I mean, this is part of our history. This battle is part of our history. Right or wrong, good or bad, it's history. It's not your history, my history, it's everybody's history in Lake City. And if we turn this into a positive where we respect everyone that and take this money instead of moving it somewhere, if we erected a similar statue that would respect everyone that was on the Union side as well and died. And to me, that just seems like a more positive route to take. And I was definitely with you, Mr. Hill, on taking the Confederate flag off our logo. But this to me is something different. And when I read Herb Ellis's article, it made one thing clear to me, that like the Vietnam War, I know that there were a whole lot of people, because that's my era, the 70s, that there were so many people that were against the Vietnam War. And yet no one would deny those men a memorial, whether you agreed with it or not, you know, and that's kind of how I feel about this, that whether, you know, we feel like it was good or bad, it was history. And by erecting a statue that's positive, we're the community that made something good out of a controversy instead of just doing something that was negative. So those are my thoughts.
Mayor?
Somebody want?
Mayor?
Yes,
Fred Coberline here.
yes.
I apologize. I heard all of Ms. Moses's comments, and my application apparently locked up or something happened at the end of Mr. Helfenberger, presumably the end. I can comment to a couple of the things that I've heard from Mr. Helfenberger. The park ownership, all of the documentation from the city vault or the clerk of courts vaults was obtained, meaning the city council meetings minutes, as well as some newspaper articles, and as well as the property appraiser information, and sent to Banker's Title, who is doing the title work and search on the city's parcels for the downtown Lakeshore Hospital Authority transaction, is researching the information. What they will discover, we do not know yet, but based on a widely distributed 1903, I believe 1903 newspaper article, there may or may not have been a lease by the city council from Columbia County of the park itself. So we will need to determine who owns the park. And Mr. Helfenberger, I believe he alluded to his communications with the county as to how to resolve that without the need of this time or money being spent on a title search. The monument ownership is expressed, if you'll give me a moment, please, it is expressed in the Florida laws of Florida back in 1927 when the monument was donated to the citizens of Columbia County who agreed to care for the monument and erected it. But also it provides some conflicting information in saying that the city of Lake City assumed the carrying and preservation of the monument. The city of Lake City could always disclaim any preservation and provide the monument back to the state of Florida if they would like it. But there likely needs to be some dialogue with the county because the county represents the citizens of Columbia County to a degree. As to the ordinance that was mentioned, I believe you all have received or should have received some time ago a memorandum that was sent in response to some of Mr. Green's questions at the beginning of July. And they were well thought out questions and required quite a bit of research regarding other cities dealing with Confederate monument issues. The ordinance that I believe Mr. Helfenberger referred to is Ordinance 2016-2081. That is not a concern at this point. There is a waiver provision in that ordinance, and so the city council is able to do what it likes, regardless of that ordinance, if it wishes to invoke that waiver provision. So that's a non-legal issue. At this point, if the park ownership and monument ownership were resolved tomorrow, there is still a hurdle that is anticipated and identified in the future that Mr. Helfenberger went into, and that is the federal benchmark. It is a federal violation of federal law to alter a benchmark, and Mr. Helfenberger touched on his comments that with the federal authorities. That also was covered in the memorandum that was sent last month. I think if you do not have a copy of it, it's dated July 15th, and I believe it's in the city clerk's office, or we can provide another copy. So again, to recap, if the ownership of the monument and park were resolved tomorrow, you would still have the federal issue of the benchmark that is cemented in the base. But the council can look to the future of perhaps resolving that issue and then consider all of the other tangibles and intangibles that need to be weighed and considered in making this decision.
Thank you. All right, if we'll move along. At this time, we have Dr. Christopher Essing, who's a professor of history that's been assisting us in trying to find some of the history and of this park and monument. And at this time, I asked Dr. Essing, first of all, if you could briefly give us your background a little bit and credentials so people know where you are and give your presentation.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, I'm Dr. Christopher Essing. I'm a professor of history at Austin Peay State University in Tennessee, but I'm actually a modern historian. I focus on the development of Florida from the Civil War up to World War II. And ultimately, part of that is about the origins of Florida's development during the Civil War, which includes then Union generals' plans to colonize Florida. So my understanding about the Civil War and in fact about what leads up to the Battle of Olustee is shaped by my own research. I'm also a public historian, so I deal a lot with public monuments and the erection of public monuments. I'm actually helping to try and create a public marker for Richardson High School at this exact moment. So my interest in Olustee Park and the Olustee Memorial is just from being a native here. I grew up in Lake City. I also helped to oversee a local historic group. It's turned into a history group, although it was really just about reminiscing on local affairs called You Know That You're From Lake City. And about 3 years ago, we actually addressed my friend John Stanford had found a video of the erection of the memorial and the creation of the memorial from 1928. I'm assuming that I think I've shared that video with Fred Coberline. I think that the city council has that video. But it was from that we talked about when the monument was created and why it was created, and we also talked a little bit about the park. I also have access to all the Lake City quarters that have been digitized from 1901 to 1930. And through that, I've been able to ultimately look at the history of the Olustee Monument or Memorial and ultimately its creation. So I created a little PDF. Does everyone have an access to that PDF or not?
Everybody can see it.
Okay, so everyone can see this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue both sides, because as a history professor, it's not my responsibility to tell you what you should believe. And I never tell my students what they should believe. Ultimately, they should come up and they should come to that decision on their own. But I will give you both sides and what the argument is on both sides, just to sort of lay it out. And then I'm also going to give you my own vision for what I think the park should be and what should happen. So ultimately, we have Olustee Park and the Olustee Memorial. Now, I'm not sure when the park name change was created, but I do think that the name change comes around at least by 1911, because I do have a postcard from 1911 where the Olustee Park is named, where City Park or Courthouse Square is named Olustee Park. If you're looking at the first slide, you're seeing a postcard from about the late 20s or early 30s with both the monument and, in fact, then the bandstand. And to the right, you're actually seeing the front cover of a souvenir from the erection of that monument. So when people came, about 7,000 people came to the dedication of the memorial. That's ultimately what you're seeing. And you're seeing that ultimately it's a monument in honor then of the 151 soldiers that died, local soldiers then that died at Olustee, were brought back to Lake City and then buried in Lake City at Oak Lawn Cemetery. So if we can turn to the next slide, what I'm going to show you, and I know that this is a little tedious, but since people have questioned then how I developed this, I'll show you some of the articles in the newspapers in which a lot of this is discussed. The best then newspaper is from the date of the dedication. So it's actually dedicated on January 28th of 1928. But it's erected a little bit earlier in October and in November. The petition is put forth to the city in October, and ultimately it's actually erected in November of 1927. The first one comes from the newspaper of January 28th. They were actually going to erect the monument on the Battle of Olustee and the anniversary of the Battle of Olustee. But because ultimately the only day that they could get then Charles Summerall, who was ultimately the highest ranking military official and from Columbia County in the United States, was January 28th. That's the day, in fact, in which they chose to erect it. If you see on the very left, on the bottom, it says History of the Olustee Memorial Shaft, how it was selected, and those who are responsible for it. So the Olustee Memorial is actually dedicated by one of our state senators and representatives, and that is W.W. Phillips. Now, W.W. Phillips is from Lake City, and he then puts forward the petition to create the monument. And of course, then the state of Florida has that monument created. Now, he actually put forward the petition in February, but the money doesn't seem to get dispersed until September, which is why they first put forward the petition to the city in October to erect a memorial, at least in when it's first discussed. So he helps to get the money, and he also works in with another then state representative by the name of R.W. Farnell. Farnell had actually been the mayor of Lake City, and the two of them ultimately will help to form a committee or a jury to decide where the monument should go. ultimately, that jury is going to choose citizens from Columbia County, and a series of citizens then are chosen by which they choose Olustee Park to be the place in which the monument would be erected. After that, then they actually turn over the festivities to the Confederate veterans and in fact then to the women of Lake City. And those Confederate veterans then will ultimately help to organize the ceremonies by which it was put forward. The reason they're doing this is ultimately they argue that this is the last great time in which many of these Confederate veterans have the opportunity in which to be recognized. So if you think about it, this is 1928. There's no significance of why it's being erected at this exact moment, other than these men are getting old. And that does sound a little strange, but I would remind everyone that we didn't erect a National World War II memorial until the late 90s, and ultimately it was part of that large push of the greatest generation, that these men are getting old, they're dying, and that ultimately we should memorialize them at that time. So they then move forward and we get a push towards creating a monument. In the middle then you're seeing the day in which the monument is dedicated, and of course you're seeing it was actually draped on 4 sides. On 2 sides it's draped on the American flag, and on the other 2 sides it's draped by the Confederate flag. If we could go to the next. So there are lots of other newspaper articles. They don't necessarily spell out the ownership. When it's dedicated, it is dedicated and given to the people of Columbia County, which in my mind suggests that Columbia County ultimately owns the monument. What that means legally, I'm not sure. I'm just telling you that this would be my interpretation. The other newspaper articles, though, don't focus on ownership. What they largely focus on is the festivities. So a lot of the festivities are based upon the fact that you have the highest ranking military official who's from Lake City in Columbia County, Charles Summerall, coming. And because of that, it kind of forces Governor Martin's hand so that he must also come and attend. And so they become the 2 great guests of the ultimate dedication. Now, because they also come, Summerall ultimately wants to make sure that everyone who arrives is well fed. So he actually sort of takes over a lot of the organization of that celebration. And he's going to go to the city council. He's also going to go to the county commission. And he's going to ask for about $250 from each to help put on a barbecue. And you see big barbecue to be prepared for unveiling day. They had to feed about 7,000 people who showed up for the dedication of that monument. On top of that, then they got the local band to come down. Actually, they got the college band to come over and play for the crowd. And they also put on fireworks that day. So ultimately, if you see in the very right-hand corner, you see fireworks where they plan to reenact ultimately the Battle of Olustee through that fireworks display. It's one of the first fireworks display that Lake City is able to put on, really in its early history, because it's the first time they'll have the money to do so. Up at the top then, you're seeing Governor Martin. In the middle, you're seeing then Major General Charles Summerall. And you can see them both within local Confederate veterans on the bottom. And you're seeing then ultimately Governor Martin and Charles Summerall arriving in front of the courthouse for its dedication. All right, try the next page. So I also then, those are all then records from the Lake City Reporter. That's of course the only newspaper that we have, because by this time the Florida Index had become defunct. I then looked at the city council and county commission records to try and see if it would clear up anything about who owned the monument and who didn't. So I do want to clear this up. The UDC has nothing to do with the monument. In fact, when I first talked to Joe, one of the first things he asked me was, can you prove the UDC owns this monument so that we can ask them what to do with it? And I had to laugh because ultimately the UDC had nothing to do with its creation. So if you actually look at the city council records, the first time that the monument's actually mentioned is on page 450. W.W. Phillips ultimately goes and he has to get a building permit, essentially, to erect this monument. And on page 450, on October the 31st of 1927, he asked for ultimately a permit to erect a $5,000 stone monument, essentially then in the city park. But if you actually look at it and you look at the bottom of that record, it says that the monument is erected in Olustee Park on land owned by Columbia County. That's going to be important when we talk about the ownership of the actual park, because in fact, it seems to indicate that the park is owned by Columbia County in 1927. So whether the city had a lease or not, I don't know, but most certainly the city did not own the park at the time in 1927. The other mention, and in the city council records, is on page 453, and it's about the fact that the ultimately Major General Summerall goes to both the city and he also goes to the county commission, and he asks them to give $250 to feed 5,000 guests. Of course, 7,000 end up showing up. So ultimately, on page 453 of what is then the 1927 City Commission records, he asked for 250. On page 119 of the county minutes, he then asked for 250 from the county to also for this barbecue as well. At no point is there any other mention, at least that I was able to come across in the county minutes, which is in the county minutes G for 1927 and 1928, where they mention the monument at all. That gives a little bit of credence to the fact that if it had anything and it was given to the county, it was never given to the county commission, but ultimately to the people of Columbia County. Now, that does not matter, because ultimately if it's given to the people, it belongs to Columbia County anyways.
Are we still on or are we frozen?
Are we still here?
No, we're still connected.
I'm sorry, there's a major storm happening outside. Apparently the fates are not with us right now.
Anything? You want to try to type a comment in, letting them know what we just experienced?
I may have lost all that meeting, so I didn't finalize it. I think it's all lost. But I have it on here anyways. Can you hear us now?
Yes.
We have.
Yes.
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 Apparently God or our ancestors is not happy right now. So that sort of lays out what's actually in the city and county records, ultimately discussing the ownership of both the monument and the memorial and its erection. So if we go to the next slide. At the time, I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the park, and in fact, when the park is created and what offers are made, since these are things that Fred Coberline has mentioned and that ultimately people should know. So the park that we know today is created in 1902. Before 1902, the city park existed off of Marion between Escambia and Washington Streets. Most of the city, in fact, in 1885 was geared towards the railroad. So in fact, most of the commerce before 1880 or 1885 was on the very northern end of Marion Street along Railroad Street. That's going to begin to shift after 1880 when we get essentially the Opera House created. It'll also shift, I would argue, after 1875 when the new courthouse is built. That courthouse then is set on what was called Courthouse Square. It's set literally right in the middle of the park. If you look at the 1885 map, the image on the left, that building in the middle is ultimately where the city park is, and that is the wooden courthouse. The X on the right is ultimately where the city park was located. In fact, in the early 1902, on Memorial Day, we have a record in the reporter saying that children are going to march from the school down Marion Street to what would be Oak Lawn Cemetery to decorate the graves of the soldiers who had died, and in fact come back and have a celebration in the park directly in front of that, which would have been the park between Washington and Escambia Streets. So if we can go to the next record. All right, so this is really congested, and I'm sorry, but I wanted to put down everything. So They put a petition to create a new courthouse in 1901, and the new courthouse construction begins. As that takes place, the dismantling of the older courthouse, if you actually look at the black and white image, that's actually the older courthouse in the middle of the park. They decided they're going to sell it and dismantle it. It is dismantled and it's moved right off of DeSoto Street. It will be split in half, and eventually it will be turned into a boarding house, which sat there until it was burned, I think after the turn of the 21st century. In the middle, then you're seeing ultimately the courthouse square as it existed after about 1905. So the building is removed. Actually, if you see around the building, there was actually a big wrought iron fence. That wrought iron was given to ultimately to the Confederate Daughters of the Confederacy, and it was used then to be put around the Confederate graves. But there was so much of it that I'm assuming that some of that was also just used to put around family plots within Oaklawn Cemetery as well. At that point, the women of Columbia County sort of step up. And in particular, what was the largest women's organization at the time, which was the WTCU, or the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This is ultimately an organization to promote essentially temperance, to drink in moderation. And they go to the city, and this is in August, and this is all covered in a big reporter article from August the 22nd of 1902. And they go to the city and they tell the city that ultimately if they offer them funding, they will take over control of the park and that they will maintain the park and help to beautify the park. In fact, they're going to create an organization called the Ladies Home Improvement Association. There will be lots of Ladies Home Improvement Associations that develop at the same time. And the city goes along with it. When the city goes along with it, essentially they say that they will fund these women, which is what you're seeing at the very bottom. That little bottom handwriting is from the city records, where the city is going to offer money to the Ladies Home Improvement Association to maintain the parks of Lake City. And they said that the women would be in control of whatever is erected in the city park. Now they're saying this, but the city does not own the park at this time. It still belongs to, the land still belongs to Columbia County. Now, Columbia County had a problem. They just built a new courthouse, and apparently the bell that they had bought for their new clock and the cupola had broke. I'm assuming it broke because in December of 1902, when the clock is installed in the courthouse, the reporter says that the bell is chiming quite nicely and discusses the sound that the bell makes. But in January of 1903, H.T. Boozer, who is the councilman of the county commission, offers the mayor and the city council of Lake City a long-term lease if they agree to buy a bell for the county courthouse. So it's offered, it's mentioned in the reporter, which is what you're seeing on the right maybe. And then in here, in the very middle, in the handwriting on the middle, is ultimately where it's mentioned in the city records, and that's on page 455 of the city council records. Now, after that, we don't know what happens. We don't know what happens because there is no record in the city council records where a bell is bought. There's also then records in the county commission where they're paying the clock company essentially over time, whether that's for maintenance of the clock or whether it was for the purchase of a bell, I don't know. So whether a lease actually went through would be largely dependent on whether or not the city bought the bell. Either way, the women kind of maintain control and maintenance of the park. The WTCU steps up, and there's lots of complaints because nothing happens with the park for quite a long time. In fact, in 1904, above the picture of the park to the right, there's a complaint made saying that the park is in shambles, nothing has been done, and that ultimately the government needs to step up and do its business. Finally, the WTCU does it. They, in fact, are going to help to plant trees, and they erect the very first physical structure in the park. They erect the fountain that you see right there on the bottom. It was a fountain with a little boy and a little girl, and they have an umbrella. That fountain would stand until World War II. In fact, the bottom of the fountain is metal, so it ended up being scrapped. That set a precedent by which the women would ultimately help to maintain the city park. That would be continued. Even after the WTCU is no longer in existence, the Women's Club, in fact, maintained and helped to beautify the park throughout its early existence, as would the Garden Club. In 1917, the Women's Club actually erected a children's playground in the middle of the park so the kids would have a place to play. Throughout its existence and throughout the existence of the Garden Club, if you look at the records of the Women's Club, they talk about the fact that they plant trees. When the azalea movement begins, both the Garden Club and the Women's Club erected the azaleas, and they erected the camphor trees, which had in fact predominated the park before it was remodeled after the turn of the 21st century. Even when it is remodeled after the turn of the 21st century, it is the Women's Club who steps up and suggests that the camphor trees be taken out and native trees be placed in. So whether or not the city owned the park at that time, it is the women of Columbia County who have helped to maintain it and beautify it, and in fact erect many of the things that you see there today. On top of this then, contrary to what Mr. Carl McKinney or the county manager might say and about the Christmas decorations, I might add that it is other private organizations who erected those Christmas ultimately decorations in the city. Before the, ultimately then, before the Downtown Action Committee did it throughout most of the 80s and 90s, it was the Jaycees and ultimately it was the Lion Club who erected and put up those Christmas decorations. And today, I think it's the TDC who in fact erects and puts up most of those Christmas decorations. So ultimately, despite what you may have read in the newspaper, that is not necessarily true. So it seems to indicate that the county always maintained ownership of the park, at least in the records, that the women in fact helped to maintain the park and that the city provided the funds for it. Now, whether or not the city ever received that lease, I cannot find that in the record, but maybe in fact the title search will do it. We most certainly know, at least from the ladies that I've talked to in the county vaults, there is no deed to the park. No deed conveying ownership of the park records. So the park ownership is a little bit up for grabs, although most likely the county owns the park, in my opinion. It's only my opinion, and that the city at best may have had a lease, but there's no record that they ever followed through on that lease. All right, next. So that's talking about the ownership from a traditional standpoint, right? So if I'm arguing about who owns it, what it means, what the monument means, they would argue that the monument was erected in memory of the Confederate veterans that had lived there, and that it's actually a memorial to the dead. And that's sort of supported by the fact that it's an obelisk, right? And obelisks are generally mortuary monuments, meaning monuments to the dead. And then in fact, it's erected as these men are growing old and they are dying, and thus it is put up in the city park. That's the traditional view. The non-traditional view is the revisionist view. Now, some people will take that word negatively, and you shouldn't. Historians have no problem with revisionism. It means that we've revised ultimately what we think about any situation in history. And it's important, ultimately, because revisionism offers a counterpoint. Now, if we're talking about revisionism of monuments, I need to sort of give you a little bit of context about what it means to structurally read a monument, okay? So it means that you're going to try and structurally look into what a monument means or what it conveys. So the best example that I can give of this is of Agnes Jones Boneyard, which of course is was a local then attraction in Lake City. I write about her, I've in fact presented on her, and she offers a really good example of a structural definition of something. So if you look at the two images of Agnes Jones, the one on the right is of her under her main archer pergola in the middle of the park, and the one on the right is of she and her husband Jenkins Jones under the same pergola. Now, if I was to ultimately talk about this, just using an old-fashioned method, I would say she built a garden and from which she sold vegetables and which she sold flowers, and that she erected trellises on which then those flowers and vegetables could grow. That would be a basic understanding. But ultimately, if I'm looking at this from a perspective of wanting to read it structurally to see if there was anything else, If I'm looking at both images, this is in the very center of her park. If I'm looking at both images, what I would say historically is this has some type of religious meaning, and from a religious and a Christian perspective, I would argue that this pergola, right, this arch is symbolic of Golgotha, or what we know as Calvary's Hill, and the hill upon which Christ was crucified. In fact, if you look at the arch, there are 3 skulls, and the main skull is a little bit higher, and you see that the bones are both making crosses. That gives reference to the meaning that, in fact, this is probably religiously significant to her. And we know that she's deeply religious in her writings, and that, in fact, this probably represents Calvary Hill, or the place where Christ was crucified, in fact, in solidifying her religious meaning. That's what I mean by a structural rereading of a physical object. Can we go to the next one? So let's talk about the historical reimagining of monuments and when this began and why it's in vogue right now. So historians generally write about 20 years before things become popularized. It's called being on the crest. And when you're on the crest, it means you're on the cutting edge. And the idea that monuments hold meaning was on the cutting edge between the late 90s and early 2000s. One of the first works that actually breaks the ground for this is Kirk Savage's Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves in 1997. What he looks at is he says that, in fact, monuments become symbolic of white power after the Civil War, and that, in fact, generally convey an image of a strong white person as a symbol of white power across the entire country. Now, he really uses an image of Lincoln, and he actually uses Frederick Douglass's words to critique this monument, in which it shows Lincoln freeing a slave, and the slave is kneeling. That's the title of the book. Now, in almost the entire work, he looks at then all sorts of monuments, including Confederate monuments, saying that these are then images by which white power is conveyed through the stone, right? Through the iconography. The one point of contention then with our own monument is that almost all of the monuments that he looks at are icons. They are statuaries that feature humans, right? They are not obelisks. So what he is looking at and what he's saying is that ultimately these are images of white men, and that as being white men, they are symbolic of white male power in the country. This message then is a little bit mixed with Karen L. Cox's Dixie's Daughters, and she looks at the UDC and the role of the UDC in erecting Confederate monuments after the Civil War, and what she says as promoting and preserving Confederate culture throughout the United States. And it is true that ultimately in her argument, she argues that the UDC moved to erect Confederate monuments all across the country, but it goes a little bit further. And she says as the UDC became more organized, that in fact they began to shape what we thought about antebellum culture and also about slavery by their then manipulation or ultimately reading of the textbooks. And she's right. Now, I would point this out. Eric Foner calls them the handmaidens of the KKK, but I don't think that Karen Cox would call them that, mainly because that seems more insidious. And what she's arguing is that these are the granddaughters of people who fought in the Civil War, and they're trying to justify their grandfather's actions. And so when you have images of ultimately slave masters beating slaves, that's not something that they want to support. And so they're going to try and erase that ultimately try and erase that from the history books. Now, the other then big contention is that everyone says that this is ultimately erected in the era of Jim Crow, and that the era of Jim Crow is then predominated by violence. And it is. The era of Jim Crow is a really long time though. If we're talking simply about segregation, it's from 1896, but if we're talking about violence, it's from the end of Reconstruction all the way up to the Civil Rights Movement, which means that anything erected during that time would be symbolic of Jim Crow and of segregation. And thus then they are arguing that the monument as it is erected, because of this argument in correlation with Dixie's Daughters, right, that any Confederate monument erected in the South is really about white power and upholding the myth of the lost cause. The myth of the lost cause being that that Confederate soldiers fought for honor, fought honorably, and in fact fought for states' rights. So they become, the Daughters of the Confederacy become big states' rights advocates. And so that's the big critique. And that's the argument. Those two arguments get combined into the last 3 years, in particular the last couple of months, where they argue that, in fact, many of the Confederate monuments are ultimately about symbols of power and white power. Now, the reality is that, of course, neither argument is holistically true. And in fact, then both arguments hold true to them. And that reality probably falls somewhere in between. Reality, at least for the Olustee Monument, is that you probably do have older Confederate veterans who their children want to see them recognized. And in fact, then this is a way in which they can do it. On the other side, it has also probably been a reflective of this moment, right? This moment by which then white power is the norm. So in fact, it's symbolic of both. But the Olustee Monument does then have elements that are contrary and of course support them. Contrary in that it is an obelisk. And when I first read Standing Soldiers and Young Slave, I actually talked about the Olustee Monument and the fact that it is a little different in that it is an obelisk. The other side of that is, of course, not all soldiers are honorable, but then it is war. On the other side, not all the soldiers that are fighting for the Confederacy are ultimately have the option. The Confederacy passes the Conscription Act, which is the first draft in American history. And in fact, many young men didn't have an option of whether or not they wanted to fight. Now, you will hear from others that in fact then that these are men who ultimately fought to defend slavery. And I would argue that if you look at today's social media, and if you look at maybe even the Iraq War, that people fight for all kinds of reasons. We are sold the Iraq War as a war of weapons against mass destruction and as a war to help protect peoples around the country. But I know, and this is just my opinion, that the war in Iraq that is ultimately pushed by Bush is largely about military contracting. Now that is just my opinion. And so if a soldier was fighting, a soldier would not have fought for oil. A soldier would have fought for then this idea of trying to protect and guarantee liberty and people around the country. But those are essentially the two sides of that argument. And of course, what I'm showing you over here is the critique. During the Civil War, and as soon as Reconstruction comes to an end, over to the right, you're seeing the goddess Columbia. She was the symbolic form and representation of the United States, and she is treating the Black Union soldier as an equal, meaning that she is standing next to him, holding his shoulder. If you look at the left, that is a white Union soldier and a Black Union soldier that have both been wounded by the war and are in fact shaking hands as equal. That picture, those two pictures are contrary to the image of Lincoln standing over a kneeling slave, which ultimately gives a little bit of adherence, right, to this idea that this is symbolic of white power over the Black man. Of course, at the bottom, I show you this image of the end of Reconstruction. Here we have the White League and we have the KKK. And of course, they're joining hands over the skull and over the intimidation of the Black family in order to try and re-subjugate the Black family and in fact disenfranchise the Black family as symbolic of white power that did become the norm after Reconstruction. All right, can we look at the next image? So that's the history. Many people are going to ultimately mirror those. And before I convey what I think happened in the park, does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask me? And I know I've spoke for a long time. I do apologize. All right. So what do I think should happen with the park? What happens with the memorial is up to the city. It'll be up to the county. The county is going to have to step in and try and deal with this situation, because the county is in fact probably going to own both the park and the monument. I could be wrong. Fred Koberlein could find something that I didn't, but I don't think he's going to. Ultimately, what should happen with the park? It's like what Councilwoman Moses said. We should do something amazing to make the park more inclusive. If the monument stays, then most certainly a second monument featuring the efforts of the Union soldiers and featuring, in fact, the efforts of runaway African Americans in Lake City who ran away, joined the Union, and in fact then came back to Lake City to help lead the African American community. Abraham Grant is probably the best example of that. But ultimately, we should also move forward to examine the rest of our history and in fact look at our history as a whole. And we can do that through new monuments. And some of those monuments are large and some of them aren't. Some of them would be expensive and some of them would be very cheap. And so the first one, and I laid a lot of this out in the Lake City Reporter. I think I sent many of these things to the City Council already. But a really good example is Harry Gaines. So Harry Gaines was a deputy. He was an African-American deputy in 1901. He is on call and he's trying to track someone down. And while he's trying to apprehend someone in Watertown, he is shot in the back and he dies 3 weeks later in late August of 1901. He is a soldier, he is ultimately an officer who dies in the line of duty, and yet his name is not on the officer's memorial. If we are talking about creating a more inclusive park that is reflective of all of our history, no matter what race, creed, or color, then most certainly Harry Gaines' name should be added to the officer's memorial on Lake DeSoto. There are other things that are also small changes, but are necessary. When the city ultimately moved to change Wilson Park, it took away the plaque and the marker for Sam Wilson, and it lost it. And ultimately that plaque and marker should be replaced. And while it's being replaced, another plaque or marker telling about who Herbert Darby is should also be added. Also, when the park was changed, the marker for Faye Bowling Warren, a great, amazing woman, also went missing, needs to be found, or needs to be replaced. This city, ultimately, in the past 20 years, has proven itself to be a horrible keeper of our monuments and memorials, and in fact, in the maintenance of those parks. In fact, wiping away and destroying the gazebo, which got moved after people demanded that it be preserved, to in fact Wilson Park. Third, there are no names of the war dead on the World War I monument. We have a list of all those names. We know who they are and why there is no list of them on that war monument, even though it's to all the soldiers. In fact, the war dead should be added to the World War I monument. Fourth is that ultimately there is no monument to the soldiers who won and in fact fought in Mexico and died in the Mexican-American War. There's also no monument to the soldiers who helped to fight for Cuban liberation and independence during the Spanish-American War. Let me tell you a little bit about that. The soldiers who fought from Alligator marched from Alligator all the way over to Apalachicola, and some of them marched to Pensacola, where they got on boats, were shipped to Veracruz, and then fought ultimately to take the city of Veracruz in Mexico. And they also fought, and a number of them died at the Battle of the Pueblo. We have their names, and in fact, a monument should be added to the war memorial part of the park, in fact, recognizing those men. A number of men also went from Lake City to help fight for Cuban independence in 1898, and a monument then should be recognized their sacrifices and their efforts as well. One of my biggest critiques of the park is there is no monument to the to the Seminole Wars. The Seminole Wars are the defining conflicts of our pioneer generation. They last for almost a decade, essentially from about 1836 to 1842, but some of them last a little bit longer and some of them start a little bit earlier. We would erect forts throughout the city, including a fort where our current park stands. Fort Alligator, which eventually became Fort Lancaster, set where the current city hall is, and in fact included part of what would become Olustee Park. Now, we have a list of all the names of civilians who were attacked and ultimately massacred and killed. Among those civilians are in fact whites and African Americans, and of course we know that a number of Seminoles and Native Americans are also killed during that conflict, and ultimately there should be a monument to them, and it would be a central monument. The top of that monument could be a bronze statue featuring a pioneer man, woman, African-American man, woman, and a Native American man, woman, arguing that everyone suffered as a result of those Seminole Wars, and it could become the central monument of the park. On top of that, I do think that there should be a monument honoring the slaves who helped to build Columbia County. I think that there should be a monument honoring the pioneer families which helped to build Columbia County. Those things are we could actually look at the census records, get out a list of the pioneer families, get out the names of slaves. It's only going to include the first names, but put those names on the monuments and in fact then recognize them. Those could be turned into great moments of healing. You could erect a monument to the slaves that helped build Columbia County on the day that they were liberated, which was May the 16th. In fact, that's when Union soldiers, many of them a part of the same, at least of the same units, they might have came to Lake City, but were stationed in Fernandina, were stationed then and in fact marched over and liberated the slaves in Columbia County on May the 16th. We should also have a marker. We could probably in fact use make one of the state markers that cost about $2,000 to the women who first voted in the election of 1920. We know that Gussie Tolbert is the first woman who was registered and in fact showed up to the polls. She worked for the clerk of courts at the time. And we know that the African-American Tunsil sisters are the first Black women to vote. We can look at the registration and the voter records for 1920 and in fact create a full list of the women who in fact voted in that election. Beyond that, you can have just fun. Part of erecting these things is you want people to come to Lake City. You want people to shop. Well, you got to give them something to look at. You got to make them want to come. Part of that is encouraging them to spend time in a park which in fact you've partially mutilated because it's so unattractive. No one wants to come downtown and in fact spend any time. So ultimately, you need to find a way to beautify that park. You could then ultimately restore the fountain that was in the center of the park that the WTCU first created. I do know that the statue is still here. I have found the statue. I just haven't convinced the owners that they should either dedicate it or sell it to the city. I think that the city council and ultimately the county commission could also create monuments to public service. In fact, one of the monuments that I think the county should do is a monument of the goddess Columbia, which you're seeing right there. In fact, the goddess Columbia held a sword. She held a shield. And of course, you saw her in that earlier image. And on either side, you would have the statue of the goddess Columbia, the statue of then Lady Justice. Lady Justice would feature all the judges that have served in Lake City and Columbia County. And in fact, the goddess Columbia would feature all the county commissioners. The city council could do the same thing. Maybe have an alligator for the fact that ultimately Lake City was created from alligator, listing all the city councilmen who have ever served. The police could do that, ultimately listing many of their sergeants and their chiefs, ultimately, and the sheriffs could do the same thing. And you could have fun. You could even create a monument to Agnes Jones, a recreation of one of her arches and turn it into a flower garden. What I'm saying is this is the moment. This is your opportunity to turn something negative into make it positive, and this is how you do it. It does not have to be done all at once. In fact, next year, 1821, marks the 200th anniversary of the settlement of what would become Lake City in Columbia County. It is when Noel Rawlerson arrived and he built his cabin essentially on the park in which we're now arguing over. And in 1832, the county will mark its 200th anniversary. We have a 10-year period between those 200 anniversaries where we can turn the park and we can turn our cityscape into something that we can be proud of, and that ultimately people would want to come and spend time in Lake City and honor that. And I think that that's something that you should ultimately move to do, and you should work with the county in order to make that happen. All right, so any questions? I'm sorry, I was really long-winded, but I kind of wanted to put that all out there. So that's all I had to say.
Thank you, Chris. I guess at this time now we'll move into our public comments, but I do appreciate Chris doing the research and the presentation. Mandy, if you want to start opening it up. Now, I do want to remind people that under our emergency ordinance or order, we limit our speeches to 3 minutes. If everybody could try to stay there, I don't know how many people are going to speak, but if you could speak and be polite and courteous to everybody, and we'd like to hear from our public, and we'll try to get through this as quick as we can. Okay, Mandy, if you want to start opening it up.
Okay, so we'll need everybody to raise their hands in the software if they want to speak. If you're on the phone, you can press *9 and that will raise your hand. And I'll take the people in the order that they've raised their hand. So first one.
And give your name and address, please.
I have asked them to unmute. Now they have to click something on their end. Wait a second. Okay, the first person's not responding, so we'll go with, I have someone listed as Kyle Green.
Okay.
Give them a second.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I really appreciate the history lesson actually that we just all learned. That actually was very interesting to find a lot of that information out. I've called a couple of the counselors today and spoke with you and kind of told you how I feel about it. And honestly, I mean, what City Manager Joe Helfenberger had said, you know, about it costing around $140,000 to relocate, and then if we did decide to create a memorial or a monument to honor Union veterans or anything like that, it costing around 120 something thousand. I think both of those prices are absolutely ridiculous, and I don't think that, you know, especially after COVID, that we should be wasting money on constructing a new monument or even removing or relocating the monument that's currently there. I think it's been there for many, many years. And my personal belief is if you don't like the way something looks, don't look at it. Now, I understand we have to come to a compromise because not everyone's going to be happy. You can't always make everybody happy. So being that the monument was originally given to the people of Lake City, the cheapest option would be to probably put it on the ballot and let the people of Lake City that own the statue, that own the monument, vote on it. I mean, then you would actually have the word and the voice of the people instead of just a certain group of individuals, you know, making a decision for Columbia, for the monument. That's just my 2 cents about it, and I appreciate you guys listening to it. And I hope that you guys will make the right decision, because we don't need to be like these other cities and communities that are getting rid of the monuments and history. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Cedric Cray. All right,
Hello?
Yes,
Can you all hear me?
we can.
Good. My name is Cedric Cray. I'm at 411 Southeast Evergreen Drive in Lake City. To me, this is a very simple, straightforward issue. You have to ask yourself a question. Would you allow somebody to erect a Nazi monument downtown? The question to answer that, I hope, would be no, because it would offend the Jewish people. So why are we so willing to allow a statue to be in our city that offends Black people? Now, nobody is saying erase history. I know that several other people have stated that, oh, they're trying to erase our history. We're simply asking to move that history to the proper location in the Lusty Park, out at the battleground. Somewhere somebody said that it's going to cost around $140,000 or $120,000 to move a statue. And my question to that would be, how does it possibly cost that much whenever St. Augustine moved their statue 19 miles with a similar size for $30,000? If somebody's given a bid for $140,000 to move a statue that far, I'd like to come in with a bid for $60,000 and use my personal trucks and vehicles and trailers to move that statue for $60,000 cheaper. But the simple fact of the matter is, this statue isn't about voting. It isn't about how certain people feel about it. If you follow history, the Confederates basically inflicted atrocities on African-American people and people of color for the past 400, or however long the Confederacy lasted. So if we are not going to erect a Nazi statue downtown because it offends people, and we understand that the Nazis did terrible things and committed terrible atrocities to a certain group of people, my question to anybody would have to be, why are you allowing a Confederate statue to still stand in 2020 that offends Black people, knowing the past that has? Other than that, that's all I have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a call-in person. See if they respond. Hello, we can hear you.
Okay, y'all can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I really do think we should, take a stand for our history in this county. And I want to be inclusive of our history as a whole. I do think that if the money was there, it would be appropriate to erect a monument that would include the Union soldiers as well. I've always been in favor of that. I wish it had happened, especially at the battlefield years ago when that was a discussion. And I'm a reenactor who sees both sides of the story and history, and I as well don't want anyone to feel like there's a one-sided history going on here in our city. But I also see that we're talking about this because of the racial social climate that we are all under right now, and we're realizing across the country that monuments from the Revolutionary War, our founding fathers, are being removed. Democrats in Chicago are calling for the history books to be rewritten and removed. So I would love to see Lake City take a stand for the history that we have here in a fair, inclusive way, like Chris, our historian, was mentioning, and Ms. Moses as well. Names that are being removed across are Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, Andrew Jackson, General Grant, even Columbus is being removed. So I see that as, racism is in the heart. It's taught, it's a sin problem, and individually we must turn our hearts to God and repent of those sins and stop judging people by the color of their skin and what happened 160 years ago, and move forward together for us to overcome this. Removing the monument will not cure racism. And it's been here for nearly 100 years. And why are we talking about this now? Well, like I said, it's because of what's happening in the country. So we all agreed that George Floyd's death was a heinous act. We're all behind that, but we want to preserve our history in Columbia County. And I want that to be inclusive for everybody. And let's come together as a community in love. Thank you. That's all I had to say.
Give your name.
You disabled him. He didn't get. She asked him for his name. You disabled him.
What?
The mayor asked him for his name. You disabled him.
Oh, I didn't hear. I thought he said. Okay, we have another call-in user. We can hear you. Go ahead. Hello, did you want to speak? The call-in user that is unmuted?
Oh, this is Lucy Smith. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes. I am just appalled that anyone thinks that you should put a Union soldier monument next to Confederate soldiers. Those Confederate soldiers were traitors. And I don't care how you look at it today, it's not going to make them some great heroes. They're never going to be heroes in the sight of Black Americans. And it is atrocious to think that we're going to be proud to have that. How can you think that we're going to be proud to have someone that wanted to keep us in slavery? And had you won the war, the Confederacy, had you won the war, then we would still be in slavery. And slavery was not a pretty sight. It has not been. It has wounds on you. In fact, we have wounds on us now. You may not be able to see them, but it's every day. It is very easy to say You don't judge by the color of your skin. But when you see that monument there that you are honoring, it's awful. It's ridiculous. And to think that we're going to be pleased and happy with that, that makes no sense. I would never consider putting a Union soldier near a Confederate soldier in the same site. And for anyone to think that taxpayers' money would go for that is ridiculous to me. And I'm Lucy Smith, Lake City, Florida, 261 Southeast Oakmont Street. Thank you.
Thank you.
Should we ask where they're from? No, just let the mayor handle that.
Okay, next we have another calling user. Okay, so we'll go with Anthony Newton.
Good evening. My name is Anthony Newton, pastor of the New Mount Zion African Methodist Episcopal Church here in Watertown, where all of our members live inside of the city limits. I want to start by saying that I am utterly disgusted by the presentation of having one historian and not having a counterpart historian from the African American community to present an argument that wasn't as biased. We heard language from the presenter that was used by people on the council tonight, which showed that there were conversations beforehand. I'm also appalled by the thought or the presentation that we could suggest that the history is the same regardless. White Americans have not been killed, beat, and abused for the color of their skin. And to present that as an option shows how disconnected we are and certain members of this council. I'm also upset at the fact that we came in with such a high bid to make this seem as it was unplausible when we know that countless other cities did it for much cheaper. And I am convinced, even though it shouldn't have to be done, if the people of Columbia County had to raise it, we could. Tonight showed that we were willing to stay behind the times. And as much as we talk about recruiting businesses and recruiting young people and making this a home for people to be involved, we are not serious about it because we're afraid of the old money that flows to certain people. We are serious about being progressive and moving forward. Some people need to look themselves in the mirror and ask themselves if they would want pictures of people who have broken their hearts hanging in their houses, if they would want exes or oppressors or beaters or bosses that fired them or cops that arrested them hanging in their home just because it's part of their history. It is unjustifiable, and I am extremely disappointed. I also want to say, if it is so important, the history of it, ask the Blue Gray or the Confederate Museum to make room for people who believe that things are precious to them. Make room for it. Make room in the cemetery. Make a roundabout in the walkways. Those were excuses that were offered to us tonight, not solutions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another calling user. See if they respond.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me? My name is Sylvester Warren, 832 Northeast Richardson Terrace. And I am in the same vein and the same spirit as Pastor Anthony Newton. I would like to say I've never been so insulted and disrespected as a Black human being in my 40 years on earth with this one-sided historian. And even for him to make light and fun, saying that our ancestors, as it was raining, was probably mad at us based on the decision that they're making about potentially moving the monument. And I've asked several times Mr. Joe Heffenberger, the city manager, to get us a counterpart to speak against this from a HBCU. He told me that he would. And for this historian to be making suggestions A one-sided suggestion did not even come and ask the Black community as to what they wanted, but to decide what was best for them, continues to show where this city stands at as it relates to the Black and white issues of this town. It is disgusting. I would also like to further say that Herb Ellis would not be a guy that I would quote who thinks that people who were raised in mobile homes are stupid and cannot succeed in life. And you can ask Cliff Wilson about that statement. I will continue to say my position remains the same. Blacks have suffered enough from being kidnapped from their native land, slavery, in which include lynching, tarring and feathering, women raped, to kids sold from their parents, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, redlining, the brutal fight for civil rights and voting rights, and the fight for one race still continues. Blacks are human beings too. Blacks have feelings too. This Confederate monument is offensive and needs to go. You would not have a monument of Hitler or any Nazi symbols because it would offend the Jews. You would not have the 10 Commandments because it would offend the atheists. But it is okay to have something that offends blacks that is more darker and evil than the above mentioned. This city and county has to do more better toward blacks. People vote to remove the monument as started, and it would be a right step in the right direction, regardless of cost or ownership. Cost, lawsuits, or ownership should not bear more weight than blacks' long history of suffering and being offended. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Gwenelle Bowden. Mr. Bowden, if you hear us, unmute. All right, we'll try Roberta Strong.
This is Roberta Strong. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It is my opinion, and after listening to the historian, that I totally agree that it would have been to everyone's best interest if there was an additional historian to voice not just that history, but the history as it is presented in other factions, and everyone should be able to understand it. I listened to the young lady who said that it's like the Vietnam War. There were people that disagreed with the Vietnam War. But if you remember, the Vietnam War was the United States fighting another country. The Union against the Confederacy was a group of states that owned slaves that chose to have those slaves and wanted people, bodies, to be treated as cattle, fought to keep that right to own people. And this is within the United States. So it's not the same as a Vietnam War. And then we're gonna look at the other fact about the money. When you talk about the money, it's okay that you have your symbols because everybody wants to have their own, but I don't think the public should have to pay the taxes to maintain something that is not agreeable to that public. And when you talk about who owns it, the city of Lake City or the county, do we have federal space for it, state space? We pay taxes as Black people just like everyone else. And I don't think our dollars should be spent toward an Olustee, a battle that was very as wrong as the others are worse. I really don't. I think it's all about, if you want to own it, if you want, you put it on private property and you take care of it, but don't expect anyone else to take care of it.
Thank you.
Okay, I believe we have Mr. Bowden now.
Yeah, you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Mayor and City Council. I like Reverend Newton and other previous speakers. I must say that I was extremely disappointed and really offended, Mr. Mayor, that you changed the way the agenda flowed. After you approved the agenda, person wishing to address the City Council was scheduled to speak, but then you allowed the professor to give our speech, a history lesson, and didn't even mention the fact that during that same period of time that he was discussing that white supremacy and there was 2,000 black people lynched during that same period of time here in Columbia County. And so just to talk about it from a historical perspective and not mention what black folk was going through is insulting. And to suggest that you can make lemonade out of rotten lemon, that don't work. The elephant in the room is the monument. You can put up Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, Rosa Parks, the Thompson sisters, all of that. It doesn't change the fact that the Joint Chief of Staff indicated before Congress that the people who fought on the Confederate side in this war were in fact traitors. And I would suspect, had Dr. Ensign did some research on the state senator, the state representative who proposed this legislation, he perhaps was a white supremacist and could have been a member of the Klan. But we know for a fact that after him, there was a state senator named Shorty Beanball, who was definitely a member of the Klan, got the evidence of it, he didn't deny it. And so to talk about it in the sense that we're just gonna make these colors and these black folk happy by putting up and creating this and not talk about the impact that it's having on us, how we feel as a people, it's just really insulting. I know he's a historian and that was fine. But Mr. Mayor, I think you took advantage of the citizens of this community. And if you want a workshop, this council needs a workshop on history. You should have had a workshop and let him make a presentation to you all about the history as he sees. But to have us on the phone and on Zoom and taking out our time to have a discussion or make some comments, and our comments come after comments from the council and after comments from the historian, I think really was unfair, and I think it was a setup, and I'm offended by it, and my attitude has not changed, not one bit by that. In fact, I am more determined now than ever because I think that you went down the wrong path with this. And I respect Ms. Moses, and she may not think I do, but I do. And I think that she really wants what's best for the community. She won't make something good out of this, but you can't get good out of something when the elephant in the room is the monument. What anything else you create is not going to change people's views. Look at what's happening with the Old Luster Festival. You can count on your hand and cut your thumbs off how many black folk you see downtown at the Old Luster Festival. It didn't just happen, that's been going on for years. And it's going to even get worse and worse unless we understand what this means to us at this point in time in history. You know, we're not trying to rewrite the history. History is history. But it's almost as if people don't understand that there's a part of that history that we resent, and reminding us of it, reminding us that you lost the war, but we still want to recognize they are not heroes. They are not heroes. They were traitors. They didn't die in Lake City. They died in Old Luster, and they buried in Oak Lawn. So the monument needs to be moved. And I know I'm rambling because I'm really kind of angry right now because I resent, Mr. Mayor, how you laid this out. And I think it was designed to influence attitude rather than hear from the public, didn't hear from the professor. I think the professor should have came last. And that's all I got to say. Thank you for I know I went over my time, man. I appreciate your courtesy.
Okay.
All right, we have another caller.
Okay.
Yes, hello. This is David Eversole. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm David Eversole. I live down in Fort White, citizen of Columbia County. I'm a former colonel in the Blue-Gray Army and a Civil War reenactor. I had an ancestor named James Goodnight who died at Olustee at 16 years old, 2 months 16. So all these monuments are kind of special to me because it's more like a grave marker for my ancestors. But that being said, that's just my opinion. Everybody has one. What I'm seeing is in this country, in this county, in this state, we have what's called the cancel culture. This monument is just a beginning. The next will be changing names of streets, changing names of buildings, schools, so on and so forth. The goal of the people that want to cloak themselves in righteousness and anti-racism is not what this is all about. What it is all about is the removal and the cultural genocide of our history. We can learn to live together and love each other without looking back. We need to take stock in today. What we have today is beautiful. We have a beautiful town, a beautiful city, beautiful people, black, white, and indifferent. We all need to get together and look to the future, learn from the past, and let God guide us the rest of the way. But the cancel culture in this country is a sickness, and it will not stop with a monument or with a street name. Nothing will stop. Nothing will satisfy these people until every street is either 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, or etc. Anyway, that's just my opinion, and everybody has one. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have another call-in user.
Yes, my name is Nathan Gambles, 318 Northwest Matthew Street. And I must say that I'm appalled by this whole conversation, demonstration, whatever you may call this. It almost seemed like it was set up from the beginning. To have this historian come on and his big display is a black officer getting shot in the back. So I guess he say put his name somewhere, so we might as well put the white officer who shot him too. That's what you want us to be happy about? This is what he get up here and tell us about. Then you have your first speaker. We already know what he's on. Then he get up here and say he spoke to who? Did he speak to all the council members so he could try to persuade their minds? I'm lost on that part. Then Miss Moses, I love her dearly. She know I do. But for her to feel it's okay to just leave this monument and erect something else, you're not taking the hate away. But what are you going to add? You just replacing this with that? That's not good either. So in this historian, please delete him for speaking for the black community because he did not do that for us today. And if we could, we would like to reserve this right to give us the chance to speak for ourselves. And that's all I have to say toward this.
Nathan, what is your last name, please?
Gambles.
What was that?
Gambles.
Gambles, Gambles.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we have another call-in user.
Hello?
Yes.
My name is Vanessa George, 930 Northeast Joe Coney Terrace. I am, like those before me, appalled at the historian. History is supposed to be non-biased. This historian was not. And we do know that history reflects the opinion of the writer. Now, I want to address Kyle Green's comment about putting it on the ballot for the people. Kyle Green has already put on his Facebook page the demographics of this city. He knows that blacks will be outvoted based on numbers, and that's the game he plays. So putting it on the ballot is already taking the voice of the black folk out. Now, the Ms. Moses talked about the Vietnam veterans. As someone mentioned before, those were patriots. They were United States military beings fighting an unpopular war. Now, a patriot is someone who defends their country. We know when you try to break away from this country, you are no longer a patriot, you are a terrorist. And every time we look at those monuments, we see terrorists. Now, we have to explain to the small children who is Andrew Jackson, who are the Confederates, what was the Confederacy? That's a difficult discussion that you all don't have to have. Because yes, it's all about history, but your side is pretty. our side, we have to talk about being hung, being raped, being taken from our homeland, and then coming over here and trying to live with our counterpart and still being treated like second-class citizens. This is something that you don't have to explain to children. You don't have to live with on a daily basis. Now, we're not trying to erase history because we cannot. We live with it every day. Don't forget for 1 minute that we forget that we are Black in America. We can never forget. And you better believe you don't let us forget. Now, about the cancel culture. This country is racist. It was built on racism. Everybody, if you were not white, you were a second-class citizen. Whether you be Native American, you be Black, you be Asian, you were not white, you were not right. So cancel culture, you say, hey, listen, they want to take away our monuments, change names, change streets. We need to. If we want everybody to feel like this is our country, make it our country. If this is our Columbia County, our Lake City, our Old Leslie Park, it shouldn't be Old Leslie Park because that does not say, hey, listen, Vanessa, you're welcome down here. Come down here to the festival and enjoy because I'm quite sure there's a lot of things we can celebrate and the monuments we can have than that. That is negative. It does not bring unity and it's hateful and harmful. I'm done.
Okay, next we have Shamari Bowden. Shamari Bowden. All right, let's take another call-in user then.
Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Hi, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, hey, to the council and the mayor, my name is Christopher Turner, 155 Northeast Frony Street. I am currently active the Army, serving for almost 14 years now. I would say that I think we could take from the recommendations of the historian, going back and forth race that we know the climate currently, but I think we can take from the recommendations the Confederate monument. I'm a veteran, or I'm still active duty, but in about 7 years I'll be labeled as a veteran. And I know multiple people who are from Columbia County, Lake City, who are currently serving and have served every force. I think we could do something to commemorate. When I go downtown, I don't want to see a Confederate monument, and that's the only thing I have to remember, not only my service, but the service of people who came before me. So I think we could do something. Cost shouldn't be an issue on this when it comes to moving that monument, not getting rid of it. But the key is, and I think everybody have stated it, is relocating, not destroying, but relocating and putting something there where everybody is included. I think we can learn from my organization. I speak as a private citizen, but my organization is leading the way. And it was a 2-day decision. Every tier of our leadership decided, hey, that is not inclusive to all the service members that are currently fighting and have fought. And it was only a 2-day decision. Hey, they completely banned Confederate flag and its meaning from all of our installation. And they're looking at now changing some of the names on the posts from some of the generals that fought that war. So I think it should be an easy decision to relocate and put something there. And I think we can do it. Put something there to include all, because we're not going to have, I heard the historian, we're not going to have 15, 20 different monuments in that area. It can't happen. But we can do something to commemorate veterans across the board. Women, Black, white, and all wars. We can commemorate those people. So I think we can do it. and that's the way ahead in this matter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Clyde Douglas III.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, good evening. The argument of inclusiveness regarding this monument, it seems deceptive. This council has previously voted against the removal of the Confederate flag from the seal, the city seal, because that flag represents hatred, supremacy, and the continuation of slavery. I think to move forward with including that under the guise of inclusiveness should not be something that we continue to do. This is one of the most treasonous and unpatriotic symbols, and it needs to go. Removing this monument, no, it won't remove racism, but it will remove a deplorable symbol which causes offense to many of the citizens of this county. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, another call-in user.
Hello? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Hi, good evening, Council, Mayor, and City Manager. My name is Mary Barlow. I live at 216 Southeast Camp Street. I would like to thank you for hearing all of us tonight. Basically, I've been fighting this fight since 2015. I stood before the city and the manager and the mayor in 2015, 2016 in regards to the seal. I personally asked for the seal to stay. I know that the council didn't really make a decision then. They put it in, they asked the Lake City Reporter to run an article asking the city to call in about the current seal at that time, and the Lake City Reporter responded back with the majority of the calls that came in either wanted the seal to stay or wanted the old seal that John Stokes had won a contest with to be put back in place. Neither of those was ever done. So now we have the little spouts, the three little water spouts that's supposed to represent our city. Now I know that the climate today just continues to attack the Confederacy. I understand that, but that is not the fight that we're fighting. These people that are asking for our monuments to be taken down, they are not just attacking the Confederate monuments. They attacked the Joan of Arc monument in New Orleans. They've attacked the Lincoln monument. It just continues. My question is, when is it going to stop? When are we going to stop kneeling to people that are just trying to erase all history across the board to basically bend it to what they want? I've been at protests in Baker County, Putnam County, St. Augustine, and the majority of the people that live in those cities do not want their monuments removed. I was just at a protest in Baker County. The majority of the BLM that were there, most of them were from Jacksonville. Some of them were from out of state, but the majority of the people that were against the monument, or I'm sorry, the mural, actually staying at the county courthouse there, the majority of the people that were against it weren't even from there. The ones that were there for it, the majority of them were from Baker County. So I understand that the city council made a decision. I asked the city council once again to stand up and just say enough is enough. This is our history. Someone mentioned putting a Nazi memorial down. Why would we do that? Why would we do that? This isn't Germany. It has nothing to do with Nazi Germany. This has to do with our history locally. There was a battle fought. The Union soldiers came in. Lake City stopped Florida from being raped, the women from being raped and people being murdered and property being destroyed. It is an honor that happened.
in this area. So I just ask once again, Mayor Witt, everyone that's there, please don't allow this to happen. Don't remove that monument. And to the person that said that they could move the monument for $60,000, that just tells me you don't care, because insurance, to be insured to move that, the one that we had moved actually in Gainesville, cost a lot more than that. And this monument here in Lake City is a lot bigger and a lot heavier. So I know there's no way that monument can be moved professionally for $60,000. So that's all I have to say, and I hope you guys make the right decision tonight. If anything, I would suggest putting up for a vote to all Lake City residents. That seems like the right thing to do. So y'all have a good night.
Okay.
And that's raised their hand.
Can I make one statement by any chance? Just one.
Mayor, the Dr. Essing is requesting to speak.
Sure. Go ahead.
Hi, I would like to mention that I would happily have welcomed another African-American, or at least an African-American historian up here to speak with me. Ultimately, when I was invited to talk about the history of the erection of the monument and creation of the monument, the history of the park, and my own vision, and then ultimately present both sides. So I was up here because that's a lot to present on. And I would happily have welcomed an African-American monument to ultimately present the other side. I mean, an African-American historian to present the other side. But presenting both sides was in fact quite a challenging thing to do, which is why it took so long. So I do apologize for taking all that time, but that's one of the reasons why it took so long. And in fact, I didn't endorse either side. I tried to present both sides as equally as I could. Thank you.
Okay. You have any more?
Oh, that's it.
Okay.
We just got a couple more. Do we want to keep going? We just got a bunch more.
Yeah, we'll keep going.
Okay. We have a call-in user.
Mayor, the historian got a chance to rebuttal to the sentiment that the most blacks felt that he was biased. Again, I went on the record, and Mr. Heffenberger told me that he would have a black historian from a HBCU, and that did not happen tonight. And I will ask everybody on the council to question him as to why that did not happen. This has come across so one-sided and so unfair. And if people can't understand the hurt and the disconnect and the frustration of how this is laid out and how this was done, it looked like it was intentional. It feels intentional. I believe it was intentional to paint a certain picture to support a behind-the-scene majority. And for him to say that he would welcome that, he should have been more of a professional and say, I welcome that from the beginning. He should have never came into this picture without it being another historian to paint the other side. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Jeanette Jolly.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Jeanette Jolly. I reside at 306 Southeast Lindell Glen, Lake City. So many thoughts. I think first what we need to consider the most is the thoughts and opinions of all of the Black individuals who live in our community. As a white person, I don't think that I know that none of us have any idea how those individuals have felt their entire lives and how they feel now living in a community where we have one monument in our park downtown that lists individuals who fought for Confederacy. The Black people in our community have had to live with our Alesti festivals every single year, and we don't ask them how they feel about it. And I don't think it's fair for us to try and formulate a solution by ourselves. We need to not ask every citizen in Lake City how they feel about it. We should be a good leader in our community, would be working to move things forward. We want to be inclusive. We want everybody to feel safe and welcome in our community. And if you take a poll, ask the Black people in our community, they do not feel that way. And I think that if you want to be a good leader, if we want this place to be a great place to live, then we need to be inclusive. We need to acknowledge that none of us are trying to change history. We can't change it. And as Ms. George stated, the Black people in this community and in the United States will never forget. There is no way. They do not need a monument to remind them of what happened. So we're not trying to erase anything that happened. We're trying to make today better. We're trying to make tomorrow better. If we're trying to cancel anything, it is a culture of hate. That's what we're trying to cancel. So as a Christian white woman who lives in this community, I want every person who is listening to hear me say that I love every person, no matter what color they are, and each one of us should be fighting to move forward together, no matter what it takes. So if it takes taking down the monument, take it down. Yes, hate resides in our hearts, but you have to understand that raising a monument so high, tall, and proud that sees over our city, it allows people to create monuments in their heart, monuments of hate. And those are the things that we need to work to tear down. But if we keep a one monument that represents so much hurt and so much destruction for a group of people in our country, in this community especially, then what are we saying to our community? We need to look at this as a whole. Let our Black communities speak and let them work together with the council and the city and the county to come up with the best solution. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
What was her name?
Okay, Melvin Goggins. Melvin Goggins, do you hear?
Thank you so much. I'm Melvin Goggins, pastor of Church of God in Christ here in Lake City. I address is 721 Southeast Camp Street, right here in Lake City. I want to, first of all, express my appreciation for this opportunity to listen not only to the thoughts of other individuals, but to help formulate what I'm feeling myself. And I acknowledge the fact that we, like many municipalities, many counties, but all over the country, once again, we're calling for and debating removal of Confederate monuments. Some want them to remain, and we acknowledge that, claiming that they are part of their heritage. But these monuments are tied to a divisive history and the denial of Black American experience. Even in place only honors the Confederate cause. And what was that cause? We have to examine it. The cause was to preserve the status quo and continue enslaving Black Americans. Without being Black, it is impossible to know what that Black experience is. Without having lived as a Black man or Black woman, a Black boy and girl, you just cannot get the true implication of what it means. So we call in, we Zoom in, we Facebook in, we talk about it. And when somebody might even ask the question, why talk about it at all? Why does the removal of a Confederate monument remain in the public conversation? Well, it's because monuments are not just a hunk of rock. They are symbols of who we as a society are. They're designed to inspire emotion and recall shared history. They're where Confederate monuments fall short. That's where they miss the mark. It is not a shared history. It is a pointed history, a divisive history. Confederate monuments are tied to a history. They do not inspire unity. In fact, they celebrate rebellion. They offer comfort to some, like white Southerners who view the Confederacy as a key part of their heritage, but they exclude white non-Southerners and outright reject Black Americans altogether. The denial of Black American experience is clear through the inscription of some of the monuments that celebrate the death and the torture and the divisiveness that tore our country apart. When we talk about historians, try as they may to give a pointed or singular presentation, the bias cannot be removed from it. It doesn't matter what kind of pretty bottle you put poison in, it's still poison. Historians are clear on the fact that the Civil War was not motivated by states' rights. Historically, that is a lie. It did not happen because of state rights. It was motivated by a desire to preserve the status quo and to continue enslaving Black Americans, to lavish praise on those who fought for the Confederacy and leave prominent monuments honoring their cause is a denial of the brutal reality of the people who were enslaved. We have our heritage, we have our families and our history, and all of us share the fact that within our lineage, slavery was endured and slavery was participated in. Still, some may argue that the past is the past and it has no bearing on today. But if you study research will suggest otherwise. More than merely testimonies to the past, the division and inequity and inequality as slavery begins remain steadfastly part of our day-to-day living. We have not moved away from it. Even in our best attempts, we see evidence of the Confederacy, the slavery, and systematic racism still exists. We see it in the high levels of inequality between Blacks and white in places where slavery was more concentrated. We talk about research. Well, research demonstrates that the relationship of poverty, schools, and segregation, so the use of and you say the use of death, penalties, health outcome, and more and more and more. I cannot summarize it all up in just these few moments that I have to speak concerning it. But if we remove the stigmas that gives a tortured history, it moves into our everyday living, we can start that journey to healing. We can start that journey to love that's not mixed up with politics, but love that's mixed up with the glory of God. Well, I want to again thank you for this opportunity to share with you my thoughts, and I pray that each of us will find that place in our hearts to take the past and leave it in the past and go on with the lesson learned in the future. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Okay, Cedric Cray.
Yes, I'd just like to sort of follow up on a comment I made earlier. I understood someone else, another resident, commented on me comparing the Confederate statue to Nazi Germany. And it really was not about Nazi Germany. It was about, the comparison was between how the city would not tolerate a monument that brought heartache upon Jewish people, but they would tolerate a monument that brought heartache to African Americans and African American community. And then she followed up with saying that to the gentleman that said he moved the statue for $60,000, it's because he didn't care and the insurance costs more than that. We don't need to hang up on moving this monument off of money. I do feel that you can move that monument for a lot cheaper than $140,000. If someone thinks I don't care about moving the monument, so I say 60,000, I'll charge 110. It makes no difference to me. But the monument can be moved less than $140,000. That's with using actual equipment, using brand new semis, brand new trailers. It's only gonna cost about $300 worth of fuel at most. So I know the prices on how much it takes to move this because I'm in this business. Simple fact of the matter is we should not be sitting back hanging up on, well, it's $140,000. Let's let that deter us from moving this statue. We can cut that right on down to, like I said, 60 if you want to. Can be moved for cheaper, should be moved. We should not have to explain to our children why we don't want them to go downtown a certain day of the year because they're having a Confederate rally pretty much downtown. Long story short, it needs to be moved. If you have an open wound on your arm right now, you don't leave that wound open, it might get infected. You go to the doctor, have that wound closed up so it can heal. This Confederate monument is nothing more than a wound on the African-American community. Close that wound up so it can heal. It all move forward from there. No one is trying to erase history. Keep hearing that over and over. We just want it moved to a better location so it's just not in our face all the time. So for the people who are saying, oh, they're trying to erase history, they're taking down street names and this and that and other, yes, you're right. It does need to be taken down and put in a proper place. Just like Germany did the Nazis. They didn't erase the history. They simply moved it to museums. They put it in books. They still educate the people on it, but you can't just have it out in public because it offends people. So what I'm asking once again is, let's move the monument. I'm actually preparing an email right now for the city manager because I'm interested in putting in a quote to move that monument. I will take a loss to do it. Thank you.
Okay. All right, if we kind of wrap it up, maybe if there's a couple more.
Right now, there's only one person that has their hand raised. So.
We'll do one more. Okay.
Right.
Hello, you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Pat Carr. I'm a Columbia County resident. I live at 529 Southeast Anastasia Street. People talk about a wound. This is a fake wound. These monuments is about the only thing the white people have left. History's changed like crazy. Blacks want to go on and on about slavery. Does anybody remember the Barbary trade? That was blacks going all around the Mediterranean, raiding white settlements and enslaving white people centuries before this country began. And it's still happening today over there in Africa. To this day, blacks are enslaving others. Don't give me that crap. There is nothing wrong with that monument being there. Blacks have so much more than they want to admit. They have the United Negro College Fund, the Miss Black America pageant, and on and on and on. They get so much money in different programs and aid and everything. Me being part Irish, part of my family was enslaved by blacks. I want my reparations. How about that? And then the other part of my family, being Native American, that 40 acres and a mule. Well, I don't know where you're gonna get the mule from, but that darn 40 acres, that was my land. I want that land back. And I want monuments put up to Native people. How about that? That's all I got for now. I'm getting too aggravated. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Well, okay, I think that's everybody. At this time, I'm going to open it up for the council. I think there's a lot of questions we still got to do as far as the research and about what all was entailed in it. But if anybody else has any other ideas, let me know.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to speak. I know it's been long and I know the council, we've all been patient with the public, and I think it's important that we have been. Since you recognize me, I would like to speak. I want to talk a little bit. Having listened, I've read every email. I've read every comment on the 600-page petition. I've talked to residents in our community, and I think for me as a council member, I think tonight's meeting is not about the past. It's not a history lesson. It's about the future of Lake City and the Lake City that we want to have for our children and grandchildren. Mr. Mayor, I think the Olustee Battle Monument will be relocated someday. And the only question is when and how. Will this monument, will this council take action, or will we kick the can down the road to some future city council? I think the best course of action is for this council to protect and preserve the Olustee Battle Monument by relocating it to private property, such as the Lake City Columbia County Historical Museum or other property owned by organizations dedicated to preserving local history. Simply relocating the monument from one city-owned property to another does not resolve the issue, but ensures Lake City taxpayers will be faced with this issue again in the future. The council should be willing to support local organizations that would step forward in an effort to preserve and protect the monument. However, if organizations such as the Blue-Gray Army or the Lake City Columbia County Museum fail to assume a greater role in preserving our local history, we should be prepared to return the monument to the state of Florida. If the monument is to be returned to the state, the city taxpayers should not bear the sole responsibility of its relocation. In fact, it is unfair for only city taxpayers to bear the burden regardless of the outcome of our meeting tonight. Returning the monument to the state is not preferable to our community, and it does not honor the men whose names are etched on it. However, protecting and preserving the monument by relocating and turning the responsibility for care and maintenance to a local private organization is, I think, the preferred outcome for our city and our community. To this end, the council should be prepared to support any such organization willing to accept this responsibility. Tonight, the council should begin to close the wounds that have been left open in our community since before the Civil War. We should show leadership in our resolve to relocate the Olustee Battle Monument to private property or return it to the care of the state of Florida. We should be committed to preserving the memory and sacrifice of those individuals honored on the monument and its local historical significance by working with local partners to transfer possession, care, and maintenance of the monument. We should show humility and empathy for our neighbors who disagree with whatever course of action we vote on tonight or that we may take in the future. I think that humility and empathy have been missing from the discussion, both in my emails and in my conversations and what I've heard tonight. To this effort, I propose a 3-step plan for preserving and protecting the Olustee Battle Monument while ensuring our city government is representative of our shared community values and efforts to afford the dignity and respect that all of our citizens deserve. The first step of the plan that I'm proposing is to vote tonight on directing the city manager to work with local private organizations on possible relocation and transfer of care for the Olustee Battle Monument. If no local organizations are willing to work with the city to protect and preserve the Olustee Battle Monument, alternatively, we should authorize the city manager to work with the state to return the monument. The second step of my plan is to repeal Ordinance 2016-2081 through the normal process. Yes, I know that ordinance means repealing that ordinance means having 2 public hearings. However, I think that this is important for our community as it respects local laws as passed by this council and affords the city manager time to complete the taskings outlined in Section 1. It affords the city manager the time to obtain a quitclaim deed to settle the park ownership. It affords the city manager the time to determine the monument ownership and make sure that we act. And if we can obtain the ownership, if we don't have it, then we should do that. And it affords the city manager the time to settle the federal benchmark issue, which I think option 1 that he presented tonight is the best option for that benchmark. Step 3 of my plan is to formally vote to relocate the monument as determined through the process outlined in step 1. Mr. Mayor, I know that my 3-step plan is not going to satisfy many members of our community. For those that want the monument moved, they want it moved immediately, and this plan is slow, but it is necessary. The monument's been 100 years in the making, and no city council has taken action to this point. I think that this plan, by being slow, it's also measured in the sense of we can be held accountable by our citizens for doing what we said we would do at each step of the way. I think if our citizens who view that monument as heritage and not a symbol of hate, but as a symbol of people of our community who are willing to fight and die for a cause, I think that relocating that monument to private property protects the monument. That's the preferred outcome in our community. So I think step 3, formally voting to relocate the monument as determined through the process outlined in step 1 is important. So Mr. Mayor, that's my thoughts on the monument tonight after listening to our citizens and the call-ins and the emails. So having put forth a plan, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion to authorize the city manager to work with local private organizations on possible relocation and transfer of care for the Olustee Battle Monument and report back to the council at the next council meeting as to the interest of local organizations concerning this matter.
Okay, there's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
I'll second it, Mayor.
Okay, there's been a motion and a second. Discussion to council.
I would like to say one thing that I think it's, even though there are people that feel like tonight may not have been what they wanted and what they wanted to hear, it certainly was for me. And I know that hearing the passion in this, we want what's best for our community. We want what's best that'll heal our community. And I think that's what we all want on both sides of this. So hearing tonight the passion that was in some people that I do love and hearing what they had to say, I think probably, Mr. Green, that's exactly what we need to do. And I thank you.
Okay, anybody else have a comment? If Mr. Green, if your motion is for the city manager to see what options we have, I would support it. If it's to make a positive move until we know more about it, then I don't know that I can support it.
Mr. Mayor, I have a series of 3 motions that I'm going to make for the council, whether or not I get a second. But my first motion is specifically to authorize the city manager to work with local private organizations on possible relocation and transfer of care of the Battle Monument and report back to us, the council, at the next council meeting if any of those private organizations are interested in taking on that responsibility.
Okay, I understand. Okay, Ms. Sykes, you call the roll, please.
Mr. Green?
Yes.
Ms. Moses?
Yes.
Mr. Jefferson?
Yes.
Mr. Hill?
Yeah, I have a question. How long is you talking about, how long are we talking about kicking this can down the road?
Monday, Mr. Hill. I said next city council meeting.
Okay. Yes.
Mayor Witt?
Yes.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Yes, sir. So as I mentioned, I had 3 motions that I wanted to make tonight. My second motion would be to authorize the city manager to research state requirements to return the monument should no local organizations be willing to take on that responsibility for care and maintenance of the monument.
Okay, is there a second to that motion?
Second.
I second.
Okay, there's been a second. Any discussion on that? Okay, Ms. Sykes, you call the roll.
Mr. Green?
Yes.
Ms. Moses?
Yes.
Mr. Jefferson?
Yes.
Mr. Hill?
Yes.
Mayor Witt?
Yes.
And Mr. Mayor, I have one final motion that I would like to make tonight, and that would be a motion directing the city attorney and the city manager to prepare an ordinance repealing ordinance 2016-2081 and having it on the agenda at the next city council meeting. I know that that's not required, Mr. Mayor, but I think it's important for the healing of our community that we do this through the normal process, and then also that affords the time for the city manager to do the work in the steps outlined in steps 1 and 2.
Okay, is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Okay, any discussion on that? Ms. Sykes, you call the roll, please.
Mr. Green,
Yes.
Moses,
Yes.
Jefferson,
Yes.
Mr. Hill,
Yes.
Mayor Witt.
Yes. Okay. Anything else by council? Okay, I want to thank everybody that spoke tonight. I think it was done pretty well. About everybody stayed within the time limit or pretty much close to it. So I really appreciate that, and that made it easier to do. I do want to thank Mandy for handling this, and I think the Zoom worked a lot better, and I think it's an improvement over what we've been doing. And if there's nothing else, then we will be adjourned.